Hi, I wanted to give a series of talks on something I'm calling Cyberealism. It's like a philosophy. So, like any cultural movement or philosophies over time, over history, um, they're not necessarily new completely. They're always taking ideas from the predecessors. And this is no different. But each series of ideas is recontextualized in whatever period in history you are. And I feel like a lot of the ideas from recent philosophy don't really fit our time. And so that's the goal of Cyberealism. Um, and in this talk, I just want to set up some of the motivation and context for what it is and how it builds on a certain tradition. Movements inherit their traditions. They're not necessarily they're not objective or universal for all time. Although even when they reach for and use universal like language, they're still coming out of a tradition. So a lot of that is putting this into historical context. Um, and especially I think about, criticisms. This is coming out of a Western tradition. Um, and there's some criticisms that philosophies that deal with the intersection between the mind and nature, which is what this is, aren't universal to the human experience, and other cultures or other cultures, even though they use language as if they were. That's a criticism you hear sometimes. And I want to just address that a little right at the beginning. So something that I've read up on is in phenomenology, and I studied in Japan for quite a while. And in Japan, there's a very vibrant movement of studying phenomenology and adapting it to Japanese thought that comes right from the beginning in the Kyoto School and Ishida and some of these philosophers that were adapting ideas coming from continental philosophy into a Japanese or Buddhist or that kind of Asian context. So I don't. So the way I think about this kind of criticism is you need to dig a little deeper. It's the job of anyone coming up with philosophy to they're coming in a tradition to be self-aware of that, but still to acknowledge certain universal themes. And it's the job of people in other cultural contexts to adapt. You use universal themes so that people in other cultures have something to latch onto and adapt, and that's something that can happen. So it's something to be aware of, but it doesn't necessarily prevent you from trying to think seriously about these themes, which is again the intersection between the mind and nature. Um, all right, so first, just the basic meaning of what I'm even talking about. So I'm calling the movement Cyberealism. That's a conjunction of two terms, cyber and realism. I could just call it cyber-realism, but if someone calls it Cyberealism, then it's coming from, then they've heard about it before. So it's a kind of test about, when you hear someone use a term, if you brand it a little different pronunciation, that kind of helps with the branding and that they've heard about what it's talking about. Um, so the basic meaning is captured by the name, the cyber side. There's a cyber side and there's a realism side. On the cyber side, of course, it's referencing to cybernetics, one of the older names for AI work, in the early days, 50s and 60s. Cybernetics, in our understanding today, covers principles in technology that integrates brains and computers or allows them to communicate with each other. I'm kind of using it in the older sense for, or in the kind of popular sense of biological AI or augmented humans, this intersection between human brains and technology. But it's flipping the kind of traditional understanding a little. Traditionally, people talked about cybernetics or cyber, life, in terms about the possibility of conscious AI that might display human-like experience. In this framework, I want to flip that a little and think about AI-like features of the human mind. So, um, cyber is talking about mental technology, technology that can think or that has experience, and the simple or the most readily available kind of example you could think of is augmented consciousness. So that starts with something like augmented reality, where you have like glasses that have computer tech built in. So when you look out through the lenses, then it augments it with certain data, digital information that's projected onto the lens. And then you can imagine just going one step earlier, where you integrate that kind of augmentation into the retina itself. And then you can even go one step further deeper and just integrate it directly into the brain, and it's the same augmentation. So AI like features being integrated into the mind, but this is even going one step deeper, which is you don't even really need the augmenting technology. You can already start to think about the human mind, the vanilla human brain as it is, as a technology. And you can think about the coding that goes into, if you can think about the coding that goes into augmenting reality by putting digital overlay over it, then you can think about the coding that goes into natural experience and looking at experience through that kind of coding. So that's the cyber side. So it's looking at human minds as technology and how that already displays human-like experience. So we know there's a mechanism in the universe that has consciousness and human experience. It's the human brain. But thinking about that as a kind of technology, not just abstractly, and this will get to the realism part of the equation. So you're not just thinking about the mind as technology, or as coding that, or as constructed through a certain kind of coding and algorithms and a certain thematic elements, which I'll talk about more just briefly, because a lot of cognitive science and psychology has a tradition of, or history of, fragmenting the human mind into different modules or different, there's not an integrated theory of mind. So the cyber part is trying to have an integrated look, but the realism part is not just abstractly in terms of models of consciousness and human experience, but actually in the lived experience itself. So the realism part. So realizing that these models or these experiences aren't just mechanisms happening in the universe, but they're actually constructing the reality that we live in. So it's looking at the lived reality, the concrete reality, of picking apples off of trees and eating them, and all the experiences that go into that as a very visceral and real concrete experience. Seeing how that's constructed in the reality of itself. So the realism is the platform that constitutes our experience, constitutes not only everything around us, but it constitutes us ourselves, the self. Actually, even deeper than the self. Just today there was an article that came out about out-of-body experiences, how that's linked with the anterior precuneus, an area in the midbrain. It's often linked with decision making, but in particular it's linked with distinguishing experiences of the self versus experiences of not the self, of out in nature, other people. You can't take for granted that experience. That itself is constructed. Even the self is something that's constructed. If you have certain kinds of mental actions, like an epileptic seizure of a certain frequency, then that disrupts this area's activity. Then people actually experience the nature disembodied. And once you recognize that happens, and how it happens, that experience is linked to the body, then you gain a deeper understanding about what it is to live in a self, to live embodied, by realizing it's constructed. And kind of the core experience, maybe if you dug deeper into your experience, you could experience ways of looking into nature that can recover some of that disembodied construction that's lying underneath the embodiment part. So that's an example of a kind of Cybereal way of looking at experience. You're looking at the experience of the real world in its reality as constructed, and being able to dig through the layers of that construction to get a kind of deeper connection, um, and realizing it's not just nature that's constructed for a self, but even the self itself is something constructed, and maybe there is no deep separation between nature and the self. So that's Cyberealism. That's kind of a thumbnail introduction. Let me give some what I'm going to call intuition pumps for thinking or looking at the world in a Cybereal kind of way. So one of the first intuition pumps is to start with, like I said, some traditions. This is a lot of the ideas in this aren't something new, but it's refit to our context in the modern, in our contemporary world, very linked in. That's already starting to abstract people's lived reality outside the, kind of concrete world. So there's this. If you think about past worldviews like this, like phenomenology and something like surrealism. So one intuition pump is to take these kind of worldviews and see how they would be adapted towards a Cybereal way of looking at things. And there's a long tradition of this. I mean, ultimately you could carry this right back to Plato, Platonic and Neoplatonism and Christian mysticism. This is coming in a Western tradition, like I said. Of course, you can also find it in other traditions and, Asian Buddhist and Hindu traditions also. But I'm developing this in a Western tradition because you have to develop something in it. Ideas are deeper when they're developed within a existing tradition, as the way to put it, maybe. But more recently, phenomenology and surrealism, and you can. And a big landmark in the middle would be someone like Kant. So Kant bridged the empiricists and the rationalists of his time with this concept of mental categories, that the real world is the noumenal realm that we have no access to. We only have access to reality as it's constructed, and it's constructed through these certain categories, classic ones being extension, and he didn't focus much on time, but definitely substance and extension. And then later thinkers, basically that set the agenda for Western philosophy going forward, is trying to figure out what's the categories of construction. So you can see how a Cybereal view is building right in that same kind of tradition, looking at the construction of experience, looking at the coding and categories and the way that experience is constructed, to get an insight to the lived experience that people are having. But as an intuition pump, you can think of an expression like that's surreal, in terms of like what's a Cybereal experience or mode of looking at the world. And you can think about, well, what's a surreal mode of experience, and think of an equivalent in that context. So when people use an expression like that's so surreal, that's a surreal experience I had, they're thinking about an experience that lampshades or highlights or brings into attention the dreamlike quality of experience, the dreamlike or hallucinogenic aspect of experience. So you're looking at the real world, but things are happening that are almost dreamlike. And to even understand why that has any significance for the surrealists, this is the 1920s, when these ideas were being developed. They were they were inspired by a Freudian way of looking at the world. In a Freudian way of looking at the world, civilization, respectability, social life has built this layer in people's way of looking at the world and behaving that give people an inauthentic connection to nature in the social world. And and from a Freudian view, that's a source of mental illness or anxiety. And if people want to deal with these mental psychological problems, what they need to do is tap into the more authentic selves, something that he would call the id, the more core human nature. that civilization has built this layer on top of trying to inhibit through this idea of the ego, um, which also, by the way, has a very long history in mysticism and religious worldviews too. Um, so this is so for the surrealists, the dream world and what they called automatic talking, for example. If you just start blathering, like speaking in tongues or something, you try to induce Freudian, tapping into reflexes that skirt around the layers built on by trying to be respectable, civilized people, to tap into a more authentic human experience. So when people are in the real world and they see the world through these dreamlike qualities, that's an experience they have where they can have they feel like they're tapping into this more authentic, because there's something apparently more human or more authentic when you tap into that. And people say, well, that's surreal. So Cybereal mode, um, you can think of an equivalent of that. So it's not a dreamlike experience per se. So there's an expression in neuroscience that's kind of popular. Um, by the way, there's a lot of things I'll be talking about neuroscience. I'm using it in a very loose way for the purposes of this kind of introduction, and it's something we would have to follow up on to dig deeper. But there's so you could contest some of these things I'm saying about it, and that's fine. There's a whole debate to be had there. Most of this is just heuristic, just getting ideas on the table, and I'm using expressions and ideas in a loose kind of way, heuristically now, just to introduce some of the ideas. But there's an expression. I think Andy Clark might have used it in his books, that even normal perception is controlled hallucination. Andy Clark's book was Surfing Uncertainty. The idea of perception being controlled hallucination is, the objective world the brain doesn't even construct an objective world from data, which is the classic empiricist way of looking at it. If you look at like a lot of mental activity, even before the data comes up, it's creating predictive models, and we call it, feed forward models. And there's a narrative in neuroscience of the interplay between feed forward models and feedback models, which of course was developed in control theory, which is also deeply connected with cybernetics, which is glorified control theory. As the interplay between feed forward and feedback models, the idea being that feed forward models means the brain is coming up with predictions about what perception is going to come in, and it's already built the perception before the data even comes in. And the role of incoming sensory data is more of an editing role. So that's what it means by controlled hallucination. Your mind is already hallucinating reality before the sense data even comes in. I mean, it's already dreamt it up, what reality should be, and sensory data is editing it. And if you start following up on this way of thinking, it's not just, that's a very deep well, actually, this idea. And one example that I remember, a lot of sensory data is because it's thrown out before it even gets past the transducers. So there's transducing. There are mechanisms that take, the light waves coming into the eye, so the cones and rods, and the vibrations coming in through cilia, through little hairs in your inner ear, in the cochlea. These are the transducers that are taking physical vibrations and transducing them into a neural code. A lot of the absolute value of those is thrown out right from the beginning, and what's sent more often, very often, I'll say, is a displacement, which is how much does the new experience come in displace the current experience. So then it's just giving, and this connects with like that kind of controlled hallucination idea. And the really visceral example that really got to me, I'll be talking about a lot about Paul Glimcher's work in neuroeconomics. I've been inspired by that. He gave the example of the color green. The color green, if you look at the range of a single, I think even a single or a handful of photons can already give you the experience of greenness, up to I think it was an absurd order of magnitude, like 10 to the I don't I can't remember the exact number, 10 to the 12 or however many. I mean, it was a absurd number of orders, um, that you still have greenness. Basically, enough photons coming where it's actually starting to burn your retina. Before you get to that point, you still have greenness. And he's talking about how can it be the same green through that many orders of magnitude? And he said, well, one reason is because greenness isn't an absolute color. Our perception of green always gets baselined, and that's lightness anyway. When you first walk into a dark room, everything gets very dark, but then it starts to lighten up, and that's because it's been re-baselined. So the mind never takes a lot of experiences aren't an absolute experience in the sense of directly representing the absolute value of photons, or the vibration, the wavelengths. Um, I would have to be careful how to explain this, but you get the idea. It's just what's the displacement of this new information with a baseline, and then it resets that as the new baseline, and then when new information comes in, then it's a displacement to that. So all new information, again, the idea of controlled hallucination. The mind is dreaming up this world, and new information is just displacing each dream and setting that as the new dream. That's a kind of more accurate picture of what the brain is actually doing for the construction of reality, that we experience around us. But that's not, especially in a Western tradition, that's not how we view the reality that we live in. We view it as the subjective world of extension, even back to that Kantian idea coming from the Enlightenment, of absolute substance out there that we're separated from. Okay. So the idea of the equivalent of that's so surreal to that's so Cybereal. That so Cybereal is being able to look at normal, not even dreamlike, but just normal reality, and seeing the dreamlike quality just in normal reality. It's when you see even normal experience as constructed. So it's really easy to look at an optical illusion and say, that's not out there in the world. That's a construction of that my mind is implanting and overlaying what should be coming from the real world. That's really easy. People do that all the time. If you read books on, cognitive science or vision, cognition, visual neuroscience, you see these kind of optical illusions all the time, as if that's the really enlightening thing. Cyberealism wants to look at take it the next step deeper, to go even deeper, to say we don't even need optical illusions. Just give me a normal everyday scene of a field or a room that doesn't have anything that we would consider an optical illusion. When you can start seeing that as the dream, the hallucination, the illusion, that's when you've crossed over into a Cybereal mode of thinking, and that's also a deep well. Because if you keep pushing that, even looking at the self as constructed around you, and you yourself immersed and part of the construction, that's a Cybereal moment that you're having. So so the idea is, it's connecting it back with Surrealism, and their way of thinking about it. We're going to edit this. I'm going to have to change, because it's not going to be exactly the way the Surrealists look at it. But just for heuristically, for introducing the idea, you can start to think about looking at the world from a Cybereal perspective as being constructed. You're tapping into a very primal and vital aspect of yourself in nature, and you're seeing the world more truthfully as it really is, than this idea of a total separation between the self and nature. That's the more truthful view. That's the view of the brain as it really constructs reality around us. That's the more authentic view of reality, and not as some abstraction that we're forcing on. I mean, people think of optical illusions as the illusions forced onto the natural world. But a Sibereal way kind of flips this whole paradigm that says, no, it's all illusions. When it's an optical illusion, you notice it better. Um, what you're doing is you're constructing an abstraction of this dead, abstract world, a dead world of pure substance. But that's not how the world is actually constructed in our minds, and it's not the world that we actually live in for most purposes. You're taking this dead world and you are overlaying it, or you're forcing it onto this world that's actually constructed for us. That's what's artificial. So, Surrealism is trying to take, it's trying to undo some of the, Western thought for the last century and a half, especially, of trying to turn the world into a cold, dead world of substance, of bouncing particles. That's not the world we actually live in, as the brain constructs it. As, I mean, live in terms of that we, the lived experience of being in the world, the actual world that we're in. Okay, I'm going to elaborate on what the world we actually live in is like, but that's kind of introducing the idea. Okay, so I'm still walking through some intuition pumps. Another one, of course, there's the Matrix metaphor. I didn't really want to make a Matrix reference, but it's there in the culture. The Matrix was always a metaphor for enlightenment about the true nature between people's experience in the world, and that the world was something constructed for people. And if that we could dig into the mechanics of that construction, we'd arrive at some deep truth about ourselves and nature. In the Matrix, understanding that you were inside the Matrix was the mechanism for liberation from these constructions and tapping into authentic human, Zion, the salvation. So that's, again, a really old narrative. That's an easy kind of metaphor. Cyberealism is, you can think of it as one kind of path to that kind of enlightenment. It's going even deeper than the Matrix, because in the Matrix, it's like a reality that was constructed for already conscious people. Whereas Cyberealism is looking at consciousness itself as constructed. It turtles all the way down. The construction all the way down to the very core of being experienced at all. And if you can dig into the construction of consciousness itself, of human experience itself, then you're really tapping into something very deeply authentic. And a lot of the categories that we take for granted, and again, the important one I'm going to keep coming back to, is the separation between the self and nature. Part of the construction is that the self and nature, experience of nature and the experience of the self, there's a kind of artificial separation. So seeing the world as constructed is also seeing the construction of the self and in nature co-constructing each other. They're both embedded in each other. You can't. There's something kind of artificial. But those are things that come out when you start seeing it as constructed. And what do I mean by as constructed? How is this different than past philosophies like phenomenology that we're trying to, or back to Kant, trying to understand what is constructed? So they were trying to use intuition, actually even back, through Descartes, this tradition of looking very careful introspection of very clear ideas. So introspection was their main tool, and in phenomenology, Husserl even radicalized that idea of introspection, of this idea of what he called an epoche, which is total separation from the science of the mind. So the science of psychology is leading us astray. We just need to go to the things themselves, was the expression he used. He just means, direct introspection and teasing out the categories directly from that. Cyberealism is going to be looking at neuroscience, the cognitive sciences, which are still in a very young state of development. It's still an early science, so people can credibly distrust some of the findings, and how useful they are for really understanding experience. But at the same time, we've made significant developments. Um, I often think about science. Science is like a kind of ratchet. When you gain insights, you're ratcheting up on top of past insights. So we've made saying it's a young science is also kind of dismissing the fact that we've made great progress, and that progress is ratcheted up where there's a lot of modes of human experience. For example, like I said, that anterior precuneus is very the action that it takes care of mediates is a term they use um, the separation experience coming from a embodied self. That's something that there's still a lot more we can know about it, but that's something we know about embodied experience, and that experience can be taken away, and we can get reports from people that don't have that experience, which gives us deeper insight to what that experience is like. And I'm going to be talking a lot about neuroscience. So there's significant progress that we've made that can already start us on this path, and we can already start developing this, like I said, this Cybereal way of looking at the world. Even with what we have now, we've had fMRI scans that have been able to associate certain kinds of experience with certain brain areas, and then we can look at the logic of that activity and the logic of, it's a deep well. There's a lot to talk about it. But we have much greater understanding now that's going to start us already on the path of developing these ideas. So as we learn more, we've already got the path kind of, the idea of how to build a path laid out. We can start doing that now. And some things about neuroscience, well, I'll come back to it. We're going to spend a lot of time on it. So the matrix metaphor. So this also brings me to the augmented reality. Which I already mentioned a little earlier. You can get an idea of Cyberealism from augmented reality. Augmented reality, again, is the digital overlay of reality from lens to the retina into the mind, into the brain itself. A Cybereal way of looking at the world is thinking about augmented experience, a digital overlay of the world. And thinking about the coding, thinking about it from a computer engineer's perspective. If you were going to build this overlay of experience into the human brain, how would you code that? What are the basic? And if anyone's ever been a pro, if you're watching this, you should be interested. If you're already interested in this, you should be the kind of person interested in programming. The way you look at a problem from a programmer's perspective, you try to break down what needs to be done into like the different functional categories. So when you're thinking about augmented reality from a coder's perspective, you're breaking down the functional realities of different categories of experience in terms of how you're going to augment them, and put it into code, first for the lens and then in the retina and then to the brain itself. Right now I'm just talking about the mode of thinking that you're in and about thinking about that as a problem. Cyberealism is still thinking with that mode, and then you turn the computers off, so the augmentation part turns off, but you keep that same mode of thinking, and now you're just looking at normal experience from the coder's perspective. So that's a Cybereal way. You realize that this code was already working before you even turned the computer on. It's always been running inside of you. You are the code. The code manifests you. So, and a Cybereal way of looking at the world is coming to that realization and kind of living through the construction. All right, so I've got a few catchphrases. I guess this is the next step into intuition pumps. Of course, some easy findings. We don't live in the world as it is, but as the world as it is constructed. It's even deeper than that. We don't really live separate from the world at all. We live deep in in the last century and a half, 2 centuries of Western thought, there's been this concept of we're separate from nature and looking down on it, as if we're outside of nature looking down on it. And this, the way we look at the brain, if you look at, it reached its apex, in the mid 20th century with behavioralism, where even consciousness is read out. You just look at pure behavior. And you look at psychology as if the observer is completely separate from the mind, and they're looking down on it literally as only behavior. You can see it in something like physics, quantum physics, the way that they look at quantum systems, as if we're outside the quantum system and we're creating rules, as if we're not part of the system itself. And then that leads, of course, to a lot of confusions when we try to think about how do we look back at ourselves? How do you look at psychology if you're only looking at it outside of psychology? How can you look at quantum physics if you think the observer is outside the quantum system? Okay, I'm not going to talk about quantum. This is on the mind. Quantum physics and the measurement problem, all that would be a separate issue for another talk. But from the perspective of the mind, we in nature are constructed together as part of the same construction or continuum. We're embedded in nature, and it saturates even our most inner experiences. There's no real hard separation of the presentation of the inner and outer experience to the self. So, intuitively, we think there's a big difference between seeing events happening out in the world and then moods that come up inside of us, or emotions that well up inside of us. But if you think from, a cognitive, again, from that, from the coder's perspective, in terms of functional categories, you're just talking about incoming data. That data, when in its construction, it's not natively coming from outside or inside. You have to construct the qualitative features of insideness of experience and outsideness of experience. That doesn't come natively. But once you have that kind of perspective, you see that exterior and interior is exteriority and interiority are a kind of artificial separation. It can be often it's a very useful separation. Other people can share external experiences, and we need to predict what's going to happen out there in the world based on certain kinds of rules, and the fact that other people can see what's happening out there in the world, and they're going to react. They're public, but then inner experiences other people can't necessarily see. People can tell you what they're thinking, but they might be lying, so you should have a little skepticism. But at the same time, there's a lot of inner experiences that also people share, and all kinds of modes of experience. When people are playing a game together or dancing together, where you're feeling, where you have a partner that you have so much experience with that you can feel their emotions coming. You know how they're going to react because you actually can feel, inside of their kinesthetics. You can start to feel how they feel in their body, and you feel that as part of the dance itself. So you can move in a way where you're moving together, where you're coordinating your actions, where you can feel the inner motivations of their actions. And of course, things like spiritual experiences. These are things that people share, that are part of their shared world. And if you separate that reality, interiority and exteriority, that would leave out descriptions or, kind of modes of experience where people are integrated in their inner experience. And that's something that's part of our lived experience, that's an important part of our lived experience that should be accounted for. Okay. And it's somehow misleading to say that shared inner experience doesn't have a public quality or a real quality just because it has some interiority aspect to it that comes from within rather than from without. Okay, so that's might be an artificial limitation in recognizing or understanding it. Next, I want to talk about norms in the world. There's a really particular kind of qualitative aspect of the external world, which you might call norms. This is something Husserl talked about. think the example he used is when you see a painting on a wall in a museum, it comes with a kind of normative pull. You have to stand at it at a certain orientation, and you're receiving it as a painting. That's already built into the whole construction. Um, and once you start looking at this, you see them everywhere. Like just walking down the street, there's a certain safe place you should walk down the street, so you're not going to be hit by a car. Um, and these can differ by cultures. Um, I was thinking of the example, like I said, I lived in Japan for many years. They have a different understanding of what's public space than in the United States, where I grew up. In the United States, so in Japan, most people don't have front lawns. Many people's houses come directly up to the street, and so the space directly in front of the house can be considered a kind of public space. And in fact, in really rural areas, people actually consider the area just inside your front door as a public space. I think that's changed. I don't think that would happen in Tokyo, but in a rural area I lived, I remember a girl talking about she was coming out of the shower and a man was standing in that space wanting to sell her something, and she screamed. Because from an American's perspective, that's already a public space. You don't just walk into people's houses. But in his mind, that was a person selling something could still come into that space just behind the door is still considered a public space. And there's a famous case of a Japanese person walking on a front lawn that was shot. He said freeze, and the Japanese kid didn't understand what the word freeze meant. But even deeper than that, this is a famous criminal law case because the man was acquitted because most of the jury members thought, well, he was on his front lawn, that's private space, people know they shouldn't be there. That's a really visceral example of different cultural understandings of norms embedded in the space, because in a Japanese perspective, that front lawn in front of someone's house, that's something you can walk across. I mean, there are American kids that can think like that too. But in Japan especially, you can understand how he thought that was a public space. Whereas in an American perspective, this idea of carving up property into private spaces is really deeply embedded in people's experiences. So it's not just a rule that people follow and know abstractly, it's built into the experience of the space itself. The construction of this physical space carries the norm in them, and that construction can actually be different in people's experience and in different cultures. All right. But there's also a lot of experiences that are, I guess, instinctive, certain like dangerous animals where people just have an instinctive, or objects where people have an instinctive attraction to, like sweet food, or an instinctive repulsion, like a dangerous animal or something that looks harmful. I mean, this is, the nature-nurture debate, where nature and nurture are very integrated. It's hard to know what's instinctive coming from nature and evolution and your parent and your, biology, versus what's, coming in from experience. And those are so deeply interconnected, you can't really disentangle them. But the point I just want to make here is, in our experience, our orientation towards the world, there are norms built into the actual construction of space itself and time. We don't live in a world of pure extended objects. We live in a world surrounded by risks and allures. Some objects draw us towards them, some repel us away. Husserl gave this kind of description. You can think of it as his answer to Hume's challenge of how you get oughts from ises. The world is, but how do you get an ought from that? And one of Husserl's responses that a lot of oughts are built into the construction. There's a lot of normative pushes and pulls that are constructed in spaces around us and in certain social situations. So you can think of, when people are talking in conversation, some people say certain things of import and there's a pregnant pause, and that pause is, the air is thick. Everybody can feel the weight of what was just said in the air, this kind of collective feeling. Um, and it's not just vibrations, abstract vibrations in the air that are indistinct, that couldn't distinguish one side from another, but functionally, people, neurotypical people that understand the language can feel the change in the air when certain things are said in a pregnant pause. Um, that's a very Cybereal way of, looking at a Cybereal mode of seeing that construction of the words hanging in the air. Um, and there are lots of other examples I've thought of. Some get enshrined into law. The way you can look at, the property law in that game in Google World that sets you in a place, and you have to look around and decide what country you're in. You can just look at the space, and you can often know which country you're in because the norms and laws of that country physically saturate the space itself and transform how it looks, but also once you start to understand the culture, how it feels to be in that space. And what the other example, champagne has to come from the Champagne region of France. If you have a set of grapes that are 2 feet over the state line in the next province over, that's not champagne, even though physically the drinks are going to be physically identical. But one of them is authentic champagne, and it's the regionality is embedded into that meaning is embedded into the physical drink itself, even though it's physically indistinguishable from a grape that, the same drink that was made a few meters across the province line. Or the other classic example I remember was, a knife that has killed someone, or some site that has some historically meaningful thing that's happened in there, and that historical event, like a famous battle or event in history, the crossing of the Rubicon, sits in that space still. Golgotha, the site, and the Holy Sepulchre, these kind of holy sites in Christianity and other religions have their holy sites where key events in that religion happen there, and the space there is thick with the meaning of that. So you're going to treat a knife that's murdered someone, it's going to feel different in your hand than the same physically the same knife, mutatis mutandis, in your hand, which is just a normal knife. Okay. So a Cybereal way of looking at the world is recognizing this is part of the reality of our lived experience, informed by neuroscience. I want to keep adding the informed by neuroscience part too, because, like I said, there's things like phenomenology that have a very long tradition of putting experience introspectively, trying to describe the structure of experience introspectively, but that has limits. And cognitive science can give us a lot of, and neuroscience and the associated cognitive sciences can give us a much deeper insight into the structure of experience, and we should draw on that. And again, there is this tradition in phenomenology where they distrusted at the time psychology, but the psychology of the 1920s, that when Husserl was looking at it, was actually trying to abstract away from consciousness and human experience, whereas modern, especially after the 80s and 90s, modern neuroscience, consciousness has become a valid topic of discussion in neuroscience, and they're not shying away from human experience. So it kind of flips, so it can integrate better, even with Husserl's way of looking at it, even on his terms, where you need to go to consciousness itself, you need to go to the things themselves. All right. So one thing I want to say about when you look at the insights of cognitive science or psychology, there's a tendency, and again in the West, to have a kind of parlor game view of it, or a self-help view, where you take findings of psychology and you think of them as like how you use them as mental hacks, where I can mentally hack myself. I have an addiction to smoking, I can use this mental hack to stop me from smoking, or I want to use my time more productively, so I can use this insight from cognitive science to use time more efficiently. or a parlor game, like, oh, this is a really cool um, optical illusion. I want to show my friends, and they're looking at these kind of quirks of human experience as something you can show your friends as a kind of trick, or an interesting illusion that'll make us laugh, or a self-help little hack, psychology hack to make improve your life a little better. And another way, many people look at cognitive science and look at it, oh, this will really help us for mentally ill people. We need to understand the mind better because we can help blind people maybe get some kind of proto-vision, or these mentally disabled, mentally ill people. We can treat their mental illness and bring them back to normal life. As if once you're back to normal life, everything in all the relevance of cognitive science disappears. Okay, so I don't like this view. Cyberealism is a reaction against this kind of approach towards the mental sciences. It's focused on normal life, vanilla life of neurotypical people. Even for non-neurotypical people, it's looking at the normal life of non-neurotypical people, the construction of reality as it is. And also there's something kind of trivializing when you look at mental insights as mental hacks or parlor games, little tricks, illusions, or helping mentally ill people. You're trivializing the depth that this material goes. So there's something that Kierkegaard would have said in the mid-19th century. This is going to take almost an existential view, which is again in this Western tradition, continental and analytical tradition. There was a split in Western thought between continental philosophy and analytical philosophy, and cognitive science. There's been an attempt at rapprochement. So I'm going to be drawing on resources from what's called analytical and continental philosophy both. But in continental philosophy specifically, there's a tradition of existentialism that built out of phenomenology, that grew out of phenomenology. But even earlier in the 19th century, in the late 19th century especially, there was the first existential revolution. And so part of living authentically or tapping into an authentic self is very embedded in existential thought. So Kierkegaard was one of the leaders of this kind of thought, and he didn't say this exactly, but he might have recognized this is a kind of line of argument he'd make. Whereas if you reflect on the mechanics of human experience or human experience, you have to be careful, because if you let the journalists, he had a axe to grind against journalists. He meant that in a kind of pejorative sense. It's not necessarily journalists per se, but people that take an experience and they make a really public facade, a public summary version of it that guts out all the spirit and all the depth of it and shows a really shallow view of it. If you think about like science journalism or something that takes really deep, even political journalism that takes really deep concepts, deep in the sociology and economics and culture, and gives a summary version of it, something is lost in the translation. It's trivialized. The depth of it is trivialized and sad. And so with experience, this idea of like you get these self-help books or little, like I said, mental hacks, these self-help books that try to give you insight to the mental life, but they're trivializing the depth of it, and they're giving you, Kierkegaard wanted to plumb the depths of the human soul and, the terror of standing before God and the infinite of the universe, the terror of standing beside that. And if you turn, this kind of, awe-inspiring experience, if you turn it into a self-help hack, you're trivializing the depth of that experience. But also you're not, a self-help hack isn't getting you to really understand the full construction of the self itself. It's taking it for granted and it's tweaking some little parameter, but you don't have any real understanding of the relationship between the construction of the self and nature. So Cyberealism is tapping into that tradition, that we want to look at experience through a lens that you're getting a deep understanding of how reality is constructed, how the self is constructed, the relationship between nature and the self. Okay, so I talked a little about optical illusions and perception as controlled hallucinations and space and experience. I think I've already given those examples before. Objects in space have meaning built into them. I gave some of those examples already. Prospect theory versus neuroeconomics. One example I've seen if people know anything about cognitive science, neuroscience, a typical understanding they'll have is cognitive biases, which is called, prospect theory. And anyway, prospect theory is problematic. So from this kind of perspective, because it's a kind of self-help hack view of the mind, in prospect theory, it takes for granted this baseline of rational thinking, and it says, oh, but we have these mental hacks that are quick and fast little hacks that are irrational, or they don't always maximize utility. But we can, if we understand them, we can undo them as if we're recovering some natural, rational self deep inside of us. There's a rational self inside all humans, but they have these biological shortcomings that if we can just undo, because they're hacks, if we can just undo these hacks, if we understand them, we can undo them, and we can be more rational and utility maximizing, and that will make us better humans. So the criticism of this that I liked, and this is called prospect theory, and there are lots of cognitive biases, like the entitlement bias. Like once you've owned something for a while, you have a certain connection, so if the loss of it feels much worse than the prospect of gaining it. I was talking about baselining earlier. As you experience things, a new baseline is set. So if something's, like when you walk into a dark room, it seems dark at first and then it lightens up. That's because your baseline of vision is at a certain degree, and drops is measured as a greater darkness, but then that resets the baseline and it doesn't seem as dark. Anyway, Stephen's power law, which is things are re-baselined. So gains and drops are measured against a baseline, and drops and things taken away from you hurt worse than things given to you, whereas from a rational perspective, they would be have equal value. Things like that. There's a lot of cognitive biases. The criticism of this that I appreciated was Paul Glimcher's in Neuroeconomics, where he was trying to provide a more holistic view of, it's neuroeconomics, so a kind of integrated view of human decision making, of how the networks that the mind uses. And one thing he was pointing at something like Stephen's power law, and that phenomenon I mentioned earlier, whereas transducers don't give you the absolute value of an incoming sensory input. Almost immediately they're throwing out the absolute value and just giving you the offset from the standard, from the baseline. That's the fundamental, that's like the thematic feature of all human experience. So when you call that a hack, in a way that trivializes the the foundational structure of something like Stephen's power law, and the foundational structure of human experience. If you call that natural experiences, this objective reality, but we have this little hack tacked on, that's denying the foundational, the structural properties of how experience is actually constructed. So if you look at something like neuroeconomics, that's a deeper attempt to try to find the structural unity and the basic principles of experience. You're coming to a deeper understanding of it, looking at it from that structural perspective, than you are thinking about it as random hacks that just are tacked on. If you think about something as a random hack that's tacked on, then you're not getting a view of the construction of experience. you're getting a biased view. The hacks look really the construction of hacks, that's what looks artificial. The assumption that there's an objective, rational observer buried underneath all this, and that's the natural self. That's what's artificial. And what they're calling the hacks, that's much closer to authentic construction of reality. And Cyberealism is one way to look at it, is reconstructing this view, coming back to the view of experience as it's actually given to us. Um, you know, in modes where we want to tap into our experience in a more, have a deeper understanding of our experience and our connection between the self and nature. If you want, in modes where different purposes. For some purposes, thinking about, prospect theory, like if you're making an investment in certain things, you want to make good decisions that end up paying off for you. You're playing poker and you want to just win more often than you lose, or making certain business decisions. So for certain human purposes, this artificial view of prospect theory is really useful, because that's the external world outside of experience has this feedback, and making good predictions that are accurate is useful. But there are also other human purposes, especially that we associate again with this long tradition of reflection, of deep reflection on experience. That goes again, but right back through into Neoplatonism and the mystics, and things. Some of these continental philosophers, and in existentialism. There are certain human purposes or modes of thought where you're trying to reflect deeply on human experience and the connection between the self and nature. In those cases, you want to look at experience naturally, and this artificial view of prospect theory, although it gives good predictions, accurate predictions that can pay off for you, they're inhibiting you. They're keeping you away from that deep connection with experience that you want in those modes of thought, when you're having those purposes of deep reflection. Okay, I think this is a good place for me to stop. It's been right at an hour, so I'm going to continue this in the next. So this session was just giving you some basic introduction to the idea and some intuition pumps to start thinking about it. In the next session, I want to talk about some of the motivations and context for Cyberealism as a view, and I want to actually start comparing it to past fields generally, but very specifically, I want to look at phenomenology and cognitive science. So phenomenology and cognitive science are two movements that are already trying to look at human experience to find out the structure of it, and I want to explain what Cyberealism is related to these two things, why it's adding something new or doing something a little different, or it's a different perspective, and why we want to have a way of thought that's different. So that's in the next section. I hope you come back and watch that, and I'll see you. Thanks. Bye.